Hi, everybody. This is Adam Wolf. You're joining Farming Fast and Slow. We have a super exciting episode today with our guest, Jeff Reed, and we're going to end up talking about the Yellowstone River Basin. Before we get into that, just a couple housekeeping pieces. So we're going to talk for about a half hour, save some time for discussion. I know that's going to be a rich discussion. There's a Q&A little section at the bottom of the Zoom that you can ask questions, and we record all these and post them onto YouTube where you can watch them, share them. With that, I just wanted to give an introduction to Jeff. I think Jeff must just kind of keep his ear to the ground for new technology because he was very early on, reached out to us. He saw some bit of press maybe that we did. And so we spent a bit of time talking mostly about alfalfa in Montana, but then you know, the more I got to know him, the more I realized that he is kind of playing this interesting role in water sustainability in Montana. And that's where I came to understand the Yellowstone River Basin and some of the conflicts over water use there, which I find it is just, you know, iconic in terms of all of the players and some of the themes. And it reminds me a lot of water conflict in Northern California, in the Murray-Darling Basin, in Western Nebraska, and both in the contours of the people and the agencies and the problems, but also potentially the solutions. And so Jeff has a pretty unique background. I'm going to let him introduce some of that to tell how it is that he came to be where he's at. And then we'll kind of outline this problem and come into some discussion. So Jeff, do you want to tell us, you know, how is it that you ended up moving to Montana? Where'd you come from?
You bet, Adam. Thank you. Well, I was born in Montana, but all my family's from North Dakota. If you're kind of raised in the northern part of the western United States, you tend to either come from German or Norwegian bloodlines, because if you have a heritage here, a lot of people were brought over when the Pacific Northern Railroad was being built to do ag, and there wasn't much to grow up here but wheat, and it was kind of the second wave of immigrants. So I always think of my family as the has-beens who never came over and got the good land along the Mississippi Delta. So you either worked for the railroad or you worked in ag, and you part of the Homestead Act. And so my family was a farming family in North Dakota, and then a railroad family as well on the other side. So I was the only one born in Montana right after they got out of the farming business. And then I went into tech really young, started programming when I was a young kid, and had a 30-year career in tech, but came back into ag kind of in midlife. And so that was kind of a hobby more so. We were doing alfalfa for the local ranchers, and then doing an agritourism business, a fly fishing lodge here just north of Yellowstone Park. So 30 years in tech, doing everything from client server to early days of the internet, working for Bill Gates at Microsoft, and then started getting into IoT early on. And so that's where I put the tech and the ag together and really tried to start solving business problems as an agricultural producer. And part of that was because I started a commercial hops business out here, which was the first of its kind in north of Yellowstone.
Maybe let's understand a little bit of how the Yellowstone Basin works. Is it mostly kind of crop farming, or is it more alfalfa for livestock?
Yeah, so kind of western Montana's primary cattle production, and then eastern Montana, we're, I think, generally one or two in pulse crops. but a lot of wheat, right, and barley, and you know, Coors produces a lot of barley up here. So it's that sort of mixture. We're in southwest Montana, and we're basically at the basin, or at the start of the Yellowstone River as it comes out of Yellowstone Park. So it's a huge tourism industry. There's probably $4 in tourism for every dollar in ag. But tourism is driven by wide open spaces and wildlife and all those sorts of things, not by property development and subdivision. So there's this kind of healthy balance between ag and tourism. People need ag because it keeps wide open spaces, but tourism drives a lot of the economy here. So it's cattle, and then obviously everything that feeds cattle is the primary production, and then you're getting more and more people trying to do specialty crops, like me trying to do hops.
And is it, you said economically, maybe tourism brings in 4 times the dollars that agriculture did. When did that begin? So if the ranching, I want to say started in, farming and ranching started 1880s, I'm speculating.
Yeah. So the well, and then really started getting driven by the Homestead Act. We're the valley that, I don't know if you ever saw Lonesome Dove. It was loosely based on a story by Nelson Story, who's the Story family's a neighbor of mine. And when they drove those cattle into Montana, this is where they generally settled. And so ranching, you know, that was early on. And then the railroad came through, and then you had more immigrants coming in and doing farming. And so that's kind of the heritage that we come from. And like most places in the West, right, water was over allocated in terms of who got it. And now you're trying to deal with different users. So if it's a 4-to-1 dollar ratio of tourism to ag, and River Runs Through It came out when? The movie, was that in the 80s? I'm getting old.
Freshman year of college, places it in 1992.
Okay. So we're about the same age. So that came out, and then the tourism, that really drove the tourism boom. You can see the dollars, you know, start going up. So it's lagging by, let's say, roughly 100 years in development. And then it scales really quickly because you have people coming in, spending money, but they're spending money because they see the mountains, they see the wildlife, they see that rural life, and they're primarily fly fishing. Well, we have a lot of water here. We're much better off than many places in the country because of the Yellowstone Basin and how much snowfall we get, snowpack we get. But we have a very dry precipitation event in the summer. So coming around late July, mid of July, and then especially early August is where you have competing interests for water. So the tourism industry driven by fly fishing wants the fish, right? The trout, the cutthroat trout, and the cutthroat trout spawn in July, right? So right about those tributaries, the main stem of the Yellowstone isn't really an issue for base flow, but it's the tributaries where you're pulling out water to get that crop production in July, August, because you're trying to grow that alfalfa, and alfalfa is a pretty thirsty plant, right? And get that crop production done as you go into fall and winter where you're going to feed your cattle. So that's the competition in that July, August timeframe. There's plenty of water, even though it might be allocated. It's really the peak usage in late July and August that we're trying to solve for.
And I want to say the alfalfa, you know, I picture center pivot. It was probably ditches like early on, but did the center pivots, I'm picturing diesel motors. Do I picture 70s, 80s was kind of the boom for that?
Yeah, exactly. And there's, you know, a lot of electrical driven pivots now.
Okay.
A little bit of flood irrigation. It's cool when you see people doing flood irrigation. It's good for the riparian and the ground water table.
Yeah.
But mostly from the pivots like me. So I'm trying to use Arable to say, okay, tell me what you think the forecast is going to be. What's my ET right now? And let's look at, you know, I've been running it for 3 years, right? And I was just looking at your new graph capabilities, which is what you really need, right? Year over year, and you go, okay, when do I start watering? Because alfalfa will go dormant pretty quickly, and you're in trouble, right? So you can't play a lot of games with watering, but the electrical bill, what most people don't realize is the money's made in cattle. It's not made in alfalfa. Alfalfa is kind of a break-even crop, but if you're driving these center pivots with large pumps and running it off electrical, your bills get pretty expensive. So when you start watering, and then when you have opportunities to shut it off and start again, because you're cutting 2 or 3 times a year, all of those predictions come into play to productivity. And if you don't get it right, you're in trouble. And I always, you know, there's a lot of old time great ranchers out here, and they just run water, right? That's what you do. That's what you're used to. But I think the competition, you know, to get productivity gains and cost reductions are going to drive people to have to use IoT as it gets more advanced.
Is there such a thing as senior water rights? So if people have land along the creek, they, you know, were probably, those are ag rights, and they can pump the groundwater, which supersedes the rights that might be associated with fisheries.
Yeah, I mean, you've heard the phrase, right? Whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, right? And so there's senior water rights, and senior water rights can be upstream of someone or downstream, right? If it's downstream, you can make your neighbors pass all the water through until you use up your portion. So that's where, you know, the fighting's for. And then you have different interests, right? You have the tourism, like I said, the tourism economy is driven by a lot of wealth on the west and east coast. And the irony is, you'll get these nonprofit organizations, and I love them. I'm part of many of them that are conservationists, but they'll lease these water rights, right? For keeping these tributaries flowing for the trout, right? So people will trade their water rights essentially. So it's no longer just who's producing fighting over water. It's a larger group fighting over water. And if you've over allocated and you have any climate change or any climate variability, call it whatever you want, you're going to have fights, right, in that July, August timeframe. So getting really precise on how and when you use it is going to become more and more required.
That is a theme that we hear. You know, some of the notions around, you know, becoming water efficient implies some sort of baseline, like using less than something. And choosing a baseline is not elementary, because this could be a dry year and I actually really need the water. And last year could have been abundant. I could have let it, you know, slide. So being able to get people water when it's essential, I think, is a time varying thing, you know, with the interannual variability. I wonder where do, for some reason, I always associate like housing development and developers with like side political feeling. I saw it in the Central Valley in California over and over again. You know, often it was sort of incentives are to, you know, give a town money up front, but then not plan for the long term in terms of supporting the fire and police departments and all that. And the same thing shows up, I'm sure, for water, which is like, you got a bunch of people, probably a bunch of impermeable surfaces, so bad infiltration, and you know, lack of foresight in terms of how much water people are going to demand. Do they put in houses without concern for what the total water budget is of the basin, or how does that work?
I mean, we don't even have a water. One of the things we've been working on is trying to get a water budget, right? Inputs, outputs, and then growth. Everything's on well, right, out here. We're a 60-mile valley, right, with a town on both sides, and all coming out of the river system. Now, ag's like 80% of the consumption, no question about it. I mean, most of that water goes back into the table and down river. But, yeah, I would say we're infants in our knowledge of the water budget we have here. I think, even if you had a high growth rate tapping all the wells, what you're going to find is just water tables in particular areas because they don't know the hydrology. I mean, that's an expensive thing to do, is to really get to know what's going on in the groundwater. People just drill a well, right? And they figure out how far they went down. And then if they didn't go far enough, they go again or up and down. So there's not a lot going on there in terms of, I'd call, intelligence for the water budget. It's really, if we in ag are large consumers, how we get more efficient is critical. But getting more efficient, you have to remember, it's the people on the West Coast and East Coast in the big cities that are eating all the food we produce. So it's not just an ag problem about getting efficient. It's a people problem about getting efficient.
100%.
And so I think what we don't like about property development here is subdivision. And yeah, you will run, if you subdivide and you're on wells, you're going to run into problems about water, if that was your point.
Well, and it's, in some ways, the point is around, I run a business, we have to balance our budget, and here you've got a bunch of different stakeholders taking water. In the past, the population of Montana was minuscule, so, it wasn't such a big deal. But then, now everybody's kind of competing with each other over a shared resource that is not clear what the total amount of the resource is.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Just go over to Bozeman, Montana, which is across the valley from us, and the growth in Big Sky, and you will see fights starting right now between the county, the city municipality, and where the water's coming from. And yet all of that growth happened because people were sick of living in high-rises in cities, and they wanted to come out here to see clean water flowing down a river. So the problems are facing us, straight on. And if you don't,
it's like humanity in a microcosm,
Yeah, no, it is. It's sometimes makes me want to go in the mountains and get in the cabin.
I look at this and I think, there's a bunch of ways into this problem as far as solving it. One side of it is quantifying it. But then the other side is allocating it. And I think it's, there's a tendency where people tend to want to reduce things to economic terms without really acknowledging that economics is just people, right? And so allocating is another way of kind of reflecting societal values. What kind of world do we want, maybe as a state or as a basin? And does that world include, the citizenry that live there, the economic engine of tourism, and vibrant, vital, agricultural spaces, which I happen to love. So, you could imagine, should we elect legislators to hash this out? Or how does that, and I say that facetiously, knowing that means that it would never happen in a way that made sense. But how does these societal values play out? Are there just town halls or what?
Yeah, I mean, I'll put a shameless plug in for the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. It's just a group of people that get together under the Conservation District and the USDA, and try to figure these things out. But I think the two things you point out is you have to quantify, right? Because you can go into the bar and have a fight over bison versus cattle all day long, right? And eventually guns will get pulled and people will die, right? That's one trajectory, right? The old school way.
Yeah.
But the other is like, so go quantify what it is you're talking about. And then you still have to overlay values on top of that. And you're seeing that our society fight through this right now. Like how many people can die before it becomes a values issue, right? From COVID. That's the fight, right? First it's quantify it, then it's like, well, what's the metric, right? Where is it like become something you shut everything down? So with water in this environment we live in, it's the same thing. And we had to sit down as a group, like we purposefully said everybody's invited to the table.
Yeah.
Ag, even the evil property developers are welcome, and realtors. And then it's really the tourism economy and the ag economy sitting at the table. So we went through that exercise and said, what is our common value? And we came to two things, open spaces and clean water. And we said those two things, right? Everything else we're going to have debates over and, maybe fight over, disagree with, but those two things are common values. Yeah. And then we go and we start quantifying around that. What does it mean to have clean water, right? And what's the science behind that? So we spend our time on that. What's it mean to have open spaces? Well, ag as an industry is extremely important. If it's an unprofitable industry and goes under, we're going to lose these open spaces on private lands, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you really hit on it. It's like quantifying. That's why everybody talks about IoT, and that's, a big part of my daily life. It's IoT in your home, whether it's Alexa, to turning your lights on, to, doing it outdoors in your industry, whatever that might be, manufacturing or ag. All my time is spent on that, but unless you know what it is you're doing it for, what's the reason, it's kind of a hobby and a game, and it's kind of a waste of time. And a lot of the ranchers around here look at me and go, what are you doing? Like, really? Like, and then I tell them, what I'm doing is I'm going fly fishing when my irrigation pump automatically turns on because it's predicted that I'm going to have this ET and weather pattern in the next 5 days. And you're out there, trying to go open a well gate. And that's, and I have to prove it, right? I have to show that I can actually do that.
Sure. It's like anything, it's a trust building exercise. You maybe keep your eye on it for the first few times, and eventually it seems like it works. It makes sense though that there's objective, like on the one hand, there's quantifying both the total resource, the stock, and then the being able to quantify the flows. So who uses what, when, and then having an objective function, so that might be, in our town, the zoning, there's a ratio between house and lot size, and so for open space, you can have, some measure of how open is good. And clean water is objective. How far has that gotten as far as getting people sign on to like targets, of like reducing housing development or restricting it to a certain ratio, or having a target amount of agricultural water usage? Or do people get squeamish about numbers?
Yeah, most definitely. I would say we're in like the second, maybe third inning. We're in a serious dialogue about what it means to do growth planning, which then leads to policy, right? And nobody likes policy, at the end of the day. But there's strong conversations around it. I do think the private sector, like those of us in the tourism and ag industry, can lead the way, right? We don't have to wait for policy to decide what base flow is in this valley, right? It's pretty easy to figure out base flow over 100 years with how much gauging we've done here.
Yeah.
And then you kind of know your inputs and your outputs. And then the question and you know what's been allocated, and you know where your problem areas are. So go focus on your problem areas. Don't try to get perfect. It's really tough to beat nature.
Don't flood irrigate on sandy soils, in July, certain hot spots, minimizing those, or how does
it gets down to the micro level for sure. I would call that the micro level, the individual level, but you're going to have regions where you've over allocated and you've had growth of consumption, and now you don't have enough water. So go focus on those areas. And in a 60-mile valley, that might only be in a 5-mile radius, right? And go work together as a group to help solve that problem for those users.
I see what you're saying. Find the places where the conflict is most heated. And, it's almost like you need that level of conflict for people to be willing to dialogue and come to some creative solution.
Yeah, and I think that leads to the most important purpose for IoT. And the one thing it does really well is monitoring. So, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? And so very little measuring goes on with water usage, right? Unless you're in a municipality, right? And you have this centralized control system. But in an ag industry, or in a basin-wide usage, very little monitoring goes on. So you can't deploy, thousands of sensors, initially as an IoT project, but you can deploy 50 or even 10 and then go, everybody, here's what we're using, right? And then the values come into play, right? And people realize, well, holy cow, most of the usage is happening right here. Let's go solve for that, right? And instead of picking a fight with that usage, go, how do we work together with that usage to make sure you're not decimating one segment of the population while at the same time solving for the problem. So monitoring is the one thing we're missing. And that's when we talk about infrastructure in this country, like building infrastructure, I would like to see part of that monitoring for water usage so that the values can come in and we can do policy after the fact. There's not a lot of monitoring going on.
Well, and I think monitoring is kind of a critical ingredient, and another is some way to objectively, view the results of the monitoring. What was the total amount? And I say that as, you can log all of your expenses, but then if you don't periodically see if your bank account is empty, then, it was pointless. So then, one of the questions I know, in California, let's say there's a lot of regs around nitrogen application, but farmers are terrified about, will that come back to, drive a lawsuit, for example, if it turns out that we're applying too much. Like, in order to get compliance, there has to be kind of reasonable, shielding from severe consequences, because it's ultimately voluntary for people to start engaging in, let's say, well monitoring, whatnot.
Right. Let's not go down the rabbit trail of we need to be a loser pays legal system in the United States. That would solve everything, but you're right. I do. It is community values based, and the more like people like in our valley, like tourism's often looks at ag and goes, oh, well, you know, they're using all the water, they're bad. And you're like, boy, they're the ones who are keeping the open spaces on private land going. Let's work together, right? And, you know, if you have a unified group, it is hard to sue a unified group, no matter what, right? So in our case, the tourism and ag industries together, we're going to go down swinging if someone, you know, tries to go over, you know, we don't have the nitrogen problem at the same level, but let's say water usage. You know, if we started monitoring and, you know, a bunch of trout died because someone overused, would they get sued? That's where a community needs to come together and solve the problem for that particular user.
Well, that I see, you know, if you have objectives, you know, as far as open space, clean water, you know, total amount of water, total, you know, revenue goals, and then you've got monitoring, then there can be a way of checking, are we making progress towards those goals? Or, you know, is next year, you know, how are we going to continuously improve, I guess, getting back to your, you can't manage what you don't measure.
I mean, litigation's always used as the excuse why not to. And I'm like, you know, whatever. You can bring up that argument all the time, but humanity as a species innately believes in fairness, right? There are outliers, right? But that's the point. They're outliers. So fairness is what we're talking about here, and you measure for fairness. That's the only reason you measure. And then you solve for the problem you're solving for. But, you know, we're taking away stream gauges instead of putting more on. And that's where you know, I'm interested in the private sector because I grew up in tech and have been in that industry forever. So the private sector is going after and solving this problem because it is an economic issue, right? And they're solving for economics, not necessarily values. But you can take that problem solving and apply it to values-based usage and not wait around for the federal government to do it.
Well, and I think this kind of proactive self-management instead of letting, you know, the lawyers take care of everything is, you know, the way it has to be. We got a question here. And let me try to weave in their question. They're ultimately asking for you to imagine what's the water landscape going to be like in 50 years, and how does technology play a role? So let's imagine instead of, you know, zero sum, you know, lawyers are going to solve this. What's a I don't know, positive vision for how technology is going to shape water, and what's that going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, the Yellowstone Basin is a long basin, so I'm in the upper Yellowstone, and we're abutted right up to Yellowstone Park. So theoretically, in 50 years, we're sitting pretty good, right? Now, you know, that's not factoring in climate change models, right? And so we're looking at climate change models, what that's going to do to snowpack, because if we lose snowpack, we're in trouble. Well, I mean, we're in serious trouble. Base flow will go way down. So, you know, setting those aside, and those are things we're looking at, which is a global problem. At a regional level, as you go further down the Yellowstone River, you know, it gets worse and worse and worse in terms of water usage. My prediction, if you set aside climate change, and even looking at the population growth models, I mean, we've got plenty of water here and where we're located. I think it's about productivity. So IoT will play a role in, is your business more productive? The values that Adam talked about, do we want subdevelopment? That is a bigger, I can't predict that. I'm going to go down fighting, right? And trying to do more conservation easements, keep ag alive, to protect this wide open space, those sorts of things. And, you know, that's my best answer.
So if the total volume of water is good, and I know it's bad practice to neglect the impact of climate change. Do you see kind of one of the main levers as being temporal allocation, let's say preserving base flows in July, August for the trout?
We already do that. That's the way the law is set up here in Montana. I mean, you either have senior water rights for the season or you get it allocated. The problem is there's no monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you don't know. Like, it's 60 miles, right? There's no one walking around from the federal or state government going, oh, you're using too much water, right?
Sure.
So, you know, you have to have these values, right? And then you have to understand that monitoring is for fairness, right? And then you move to policy and litigation.
Like when you talk about monitoring, part of me thinks like, gosh, you know, there's an economy. What's the size of the economy? We must be talking about billions of dollars for
Montana or for this part. For Park County, I think I looked at the 2015 ag census and it was, oh God, I'm going to be wrong. It was either 25 or 50 million in production that, you know, went out. And then there was about it was 200 million in tourism for this county alone, roughly. So that's runs up to 4 to 1. Okay.
That makes sense. So then, so we've got, let's say, $300 million. And then, you know, the sustainability of that over the long term, obviously it accrues into a huge amount of revenue. And then monitoring, I would have to speculate, like the USGS allocates, I don't know, not more than $1 million for monitoring those river gauges in your part of Montana. And I would speculate that between satellites and sensors, you know, this would cost like tens, maybe, you know, low hundreds of thousands of dollars for monitoring, which is to say kind of small in relation to solving the problem.
Yeah, I mean, the USGS gauging stations are really good. I mean, they're done right, but they're expensive, right? We have 2 in the 60-mile basin I'm in. Yeah. About 3 years ago, we started our own initiative, and we did low-cost monitoring at scale, so like 60 sensors across the river, and you get enough distribution that you can manage for error rate, right? You can see, you know, the signal and the noise, and we did that at a fraction of the cost. And then we teamed up with the fly fishing guides, and we had them do manual water sampling. And over a 60-mile radius, I think we broke a Guinness Book of World Records. We did in a single footprint, like a single snapshot of time, a water dip right across 60 miles, and then tested for them.
Wow.
So that's real signal, right, that you're seeing there. And so you can do this at a community science level where there's a motivation, like these open spaces, clean water that drives the economy. Yeah. So that's how we're solving for. We still need the USGS stations because they're really accurate, good, they're up, you know, but we can add to that in a private public way. So that's one of the things we're doing that over time I think will solve for this monitoring and measuring gap we have.
And I mean, I guess the larger message is 100% achievable, you know, using technology we have more or less in hand. I think
it's coming from folks like you guys. I mean, it's the private sector that's driving costs down, because that's my industry is components, driving that cost on the scale that me as a private landowner can drop one of these sensors in my well. And now I know if I have water quality issues in my well, and I get a text message right away, right? Instead of testing once a year and then getting E. coli a week later, you know, the silliness that goes on today. So I think, you know, theoretically it can get better.
We got another question which really ties to the more difficult part is not the technological one, but the kind of human values one. And this again goes back to who decides which values are the right ones, you know? And question is also, how do we ensure special interests don't co-opt monitoring for their own benefit? And I have to imagine there's an aspect of that where there's, you know, longtime residents, newcomers, you reference East Coast donors to environmental organizations. There must be a lot of discussion about, you know, whose opinion is legitimate, whose is less legitimate. Like, how does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, the first question, I mean, in a democracy, right, the majority decides what are the right ones, right? In a dictatorship, the dictator decides. So in a sense, in our county, we're frankly a democracy, but as a group of people, we've just decided anybody can attend. Even people from outside of our region can attend meetings. You have to be living in the local area to be part of the steering committee, but the votes are public, right? You come in and you can vote. So we always talk about stacking the deck for a particular vote, right? So, you know, you can have all those games getting played, but by definition, we just say anybody's invited to a meeting, anybody can have their say. So that's how we function, right? And they're different organizational structures. The second question, part of the question is, you know, how do other people co-opt it? I'm from the software industry, and I worked for Microsoft for a short time, and they made a lot of money on a private operating system, right, that they controlled. And then things like Linux came out, and those of us in that industry saw the benefit of open source for driving innovation that solved different problems.
Yeah.
And so I kind of apply that same model, even Microsoft adopted that model today, to this monitoring solution is open source the data, make it generally public. That's the only way you can kind of co-opt people maybe from doing their own monitoring and scrubbing the data in the way they want. Just make this data, so you can go to our website, look at the RiverNet project, download the data, and prove us wrong, right? Your theory about, you know, nitrogen levels in this tributary is wrong because, right? Yeah. So that's how we deal with the co-opting problem. It doesn't make it any easier, but that's how we face it.
One of the guests a couple weeks ago was a PhD student. She was working on kind of water conflicts on Mount Kenya. And there, everybody was convinced everybody was using more water or got more water than they did. And they left the spigot on basically full time. Yeah. And, you know, you could be taking the most and still be convinced that you're getting screwed. And so there is something I think about everyone being able to scrutinize the data that is kind of the only way to assure accountability, you know, is that there's a certain amount of daylight. Not that I'm advocating, I mean, there's, you know, in agriculture, nobody wants to share their secrets necessarily, and nobody wants to be regulated. So there's this funny balance about, well, how do we create data to allow for this public good to happen, which is the maintenance of the agricultural economy, while at the same time not getting dinged for it?
When you know the answer to that, it's called competition, right? This was the whole point about tech and open source. If you open source the operating system, you would have this flush of innovation, right? Because developers didn't have to pay to use this system to develop some layer of value on top of it. And so, I mean, this is a, you know, philosophical capitalist debate. It's free markets, right? It's, you know, monitor, right? And then let innovation drive it from there. Because if you've over allocated, you can either let evolution and nature dictate to you what's going to happen, because if you've over allocated, you know, there's not going to be water, people are going to die, people are going to shoot each other. That's what chaos, you know, comes to. Or you can say, let's open source this data and let people innovate off that data to maybe put in, you know, an actuator on, you know, the headgate to open and close it precisely, right? Humans have solved some pretty cool problems. So what if you open that headgate precisely to the allocated water, and then everybody downstream has to figure out how they're going to use it? So there's some simple things we talked about earlier that you can do, because most ditch systems have a headgate. And the headgate is really where you know a lot about how much has been allocated for that headgate and where it needs to be open to for that much water to come downstream. That's where I would.
Well, what you're reminding me of is the tools that they used to control sulfur pollution from power plants in the Northeast going back, it's probably the 90s, which is by placing a cap, then everybody was free to figure out how to comply, and that could mean selling your permit to somebody else, or it could mean investing in technology, or it could be, you know, finding a higher value for your product so that you can afford to, you know, buy some more. So in your case, I mean, the hops is a great example, where the dollar value of the crop per unit water is significantly higher in hops.
Yeah, and you don't have to center pivot. You can drip line. I mean, so that was one of my theories, right? So I mean, it doesn't mean humans aren't going to drive ourselves to death anyway by these choices we make. But I do think it's the one system, other than the psychology that you described about the Kenya problem, where, I mean, this has been proven in all sorts of species, right? You either share equitably and it's open, like you can see who's sharing and getting what, or you revert to consuming everything you possibly can consume. Sorry, that's my center nearby.
I'm in a college, so I view that everything is competing like nuts with everything else. Cooperation, I don't want to be a pessimist about altruism and cooperation, but like my assumption is by default, you can't just hope that it's going to happen, you know? Yep. And the competition really, is what drives dynamics, you know, and so that's what leads to someone, a questioner wrote in wondering whether there are any examples of cap and trade for water. And I want to say that exists now. I can name a couple places in California, Nebraska. Mammoth Water is a trading company. There's kind of various other water markets that have emerged more or less out of the existence of a constraint that there's a finite amount of water, you know? And so
we have that here. I mean, you can lease, you can do stream side mitigation, you know, trade, you know, those sorts of things. So that is part of the solution, no question about it. But at the end of the day, still, if you don't know what people are using, you know, is it a stats game already?
Well, it's just a fantasy to think that it's ever going to turn out right without ever taking the measurements to verify that the outcome, you know, are you even tracking in the right direction? And arguably, you don't even know whether you're going in the right way, you know?
Yeah. Unless we put birth control in the water system and the population goes in half, it's going to get more difficult.
I'm going to ask if anybody has a last question to post it now. Otherwise, Jeff, I'm going to ask if you have any last thoughts before we part.
No, I mean, feel free to reach out if you're in a watershed group or you're in IoT. I'm not doing this for Adam, but I mean, the sort of stuff they're innovating. I was taking one of my old marks today and scraping the top off of it from calcium and bird poop and, you know, all those things that are getting worked out in the graph, going back and looking over 3 years of data before I got on the call and seeing things that I never thought about. It's fun. I mean, I love it. And I know it's helping me as a producer as well. So if you've got examples you want to share, especially if you're in the alfalfa industry, please reach out to me. I don't know if you're putting our contact information on, but we'd like to learn from other groups and what they're doing as well.
Yeah, do you want to say your email now? And we don't have to put it
Yeah,
in the YouTube link because you'll get spammed. But I think if anybody's stuck
yeah,
with
no,
us
that's
for now.
good. It's Jeff, Jeff at reedfly.com, reedfly.com, and we're the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. You can go to that website, upperyellowstone.org, look at the things we're doing with IoT, including the MARC to do, water mitigation solutions in this valley.
I love it. It's really multifaceted between monitoring the rivers, the ag land, you've got policy, you've got kind of the forums and the political side of it. So it's a real inspiration. I appreciate your coming on.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for everything you do. Hopefully it was helpful.
All right. So next week, we are going to host Nick Andrews coming from Oregon State. And we're going to be talking about the OSU PestCast, the IBM, or pardon me, IPM system for the Pacific Northwest. If you've got ideas for future topics, I'd appreciate it. We're probably going to switch in the fall to a podcast format, so you can listen to it, as they say, wherever you get your podcasts. And I appreciate your joining us. So thank you very much. Till next week.